we are here to talk to you about John Brown, a pre-Civil War American hero. Now, John Brown was born on the 9th of May, 1800, and he met his end on the 2nd of December, 1859. John Brown was considered the most controversial American of the 19th century, and also the first domestic terrorist in America. You're about to learn why. Join us. Now, for this part of the presentation, we were going to examine John Brown's early life and his upbringing, and this is to provide us with some insight on John Brown's personal philosophy and some of his actions that he committed later in his life. First of all, Brown was born in Torrington, Connecticut in 1800, and his earliest family members were Puritans. Brown's grandfather was also a commander in Washington's army during the American Revolution. John's father, Owen Brown, was a Calvinist and a strict disciplinarian. He was also an abolitionist who helped create the Underground Railroad, which we know was a system that helped escaped slaves escape to freedom in the North. John Brown's mother, Ruth, died when he was 8 years old, and Owen, his father, remarried, and John became a little rebellious after that point. He stayed with the family of a U.S. Marshal during this time, and during this time he also saw a slave being severely beaten, and this deeply moved John. It was a big experience in his life that formed his philosophy. And after this, John Brown began to study the Bible, and he joined a church. He felt strongly that people must act on religious convictions, and he, after that, went to study in Massachusetts and prepare for school. But after he failed out of school, he returned home to Connecticut, and he began to work at his father's tannery. We'll now move on to John Brown's early adult life. As I previously said, at this point in his life, he operated and worked in a tannery with his father, but after this, he moved to Pennsylvania and opened his own tannery. He also married his love Diane Flusk in 1820, and they together had 7 children. Now, unfortunately, 11 years later, in 1831, his wife died, but later that year in 1831, he remarried a woman of 16 years old named Mary Ann Day, and together they had 13 children. The running total for his kids is now 20. So, with them, he's tried to start some more businesses, but he failed. And from this, he became very financially burdened and worried at his situation. After this, he began to empathize with the weak and the repressed of the nation, which obviously in the 1830s was the slaves. Very weak, very repressed. We all know this. He moved to upstate New York at this point, and he lived with a community of former slaves. And through this, he became involved in the Underground Railroad. Also, in 1837, he said, "Here before God, in the presence of these witnesses, from this time I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery." At this point, his mission was clear. John Brown became a militant abolitionist and organized self-protection leagues for free blacks and fugitive slaves, and he also organized the League of Gileadites, which was founded after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850.
He took a stand on racial integration, on slavery. There were a lot of highly motivated, well-intended people in those days who opposed slavery. William Lloyd Garrison, Abraham Lincoln, Wendell Phillips, Lydia Maria Child. One could go on and on of the people who disliked slavery and who took their own kind of stand. John Brown, however, was different because he was one of the only whites of that period who was completely untouched by the prevalent racism of his day, and he took a stand on the issue of race.
Leaving Kansas. Now, we all know that John Brown was part of this bloody controversy that broke out in Kansas in the 1850s, but why and how was John Brown part of it? Join us, we'll examine this right here.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 placed the decision of slavery with the people of the settling territories. Settlers on both sides converged in Kansas with the hopes of influencing the decision on slavery. This included 5 of John Brown's sons. Brown wrote to them to find out what they needed. They responded, "Guns." John Brown went to Kansas to help his sons. Brown selected and killed 5 men who had threatened him and other Free Staters.
These murders by Brown and his men were retaliatory acts that came after the sack of Lawrence, the Free State capital, and also as a result of the beating of Senator Charles Sumner, almost killed on the floor of the U.S.
This event became known as Bleeding Kansas. The stage is set now. Bleeding Kansas is in full force, and John Brown must take action. So what does he do? In the 1950s, Brown sent some of his sons to Kansas to acquire land and to fight the slavery crisis. And in 1955, Brown finally moved himself to Kansas, and he brought a lot of weapons with him, as this was going to be a pretty tough fight to win. In 1856, Brown, along with 4 of his sons and 2 others, brutally killed pro-slavery activists at the Potawatomi Massacre. After this, John Brown returned to Ohio and developed a plan of action for the rest of what would be Bleeding Kansas and his life.
It wasn't just that John Brown thought it might be a good idea to use violence. He had reasoned that after the Dred Scott case, which took citizenship away from black folks and also said that a black man has no rights, that a white man needs respect, he realized there was no legislative cure, there was no judicial cure, so there was no legal way to end or even limit slavery, because all the compromises that had been made between this is going to be a free state and this is going to be a slave state meant nothing. If you could take a slave into a free state, he'd still be a slave. What does it mean to have a free state? It means nothing.
In October of 1859, John Brown made plans to attack a U.S. federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. He wanted the guns from the arsenal for slaves who were willing to fight for their freedom. Brown's plan was that the slaves would rebel and fight against their masters. However, this plan would not succeed. The raid at Harper's Ferry would be considered a beginning to the U.S. Civil War and an end for John Brown.
Brown met multiple times with Frederick Douglass to discuss his developing plans to raid the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia.
Brown begged Douglass to come with him. He thought he would be essential to help organize and attract enslaved people who might join them. He said, "Douglass, when the bees begin to swarm, I want you to help me hive them." And again, Douglass refused to come.
John Brown rented a farm in nearby Maryland where he secretly gathered arms and 21 supporters for his raid. On October 16, 1859, Brown attacked the armory at Harper's Ferry. He had planned to seize the arsenal and retreat to the mountains with his army of men. He was certain that local slaves would rise up and join him. His plan was to shepherd the weaker of the slaves to freedom in the north, and to enlist the stronger, willing slaves in guerrilla warfare against the slave-holding communities, where more would be freed to escape or fight. The details of what happened during the raid and why John Brown failed to succeed in his mission are the subject of never-ending debate. Some say that he did not receive the support that he expected. Others say that more than 50 local slaves did come to his aid and that there was a successful cover-up of their involvement. What is certain is that John Brown easily overtook the arsenal, but he hesitated when he could have escaped. He treated his prisoners with great care, but there was innocent blood shed during the raid, most notably a freed black man named Hayward Shepherd. The local militia rose to defend the armory, and when word reached Washington, President Buchanan sent Robert E. Lee and the Marines to put an end to the raid. During the event, 17 people were killed, including 2 of Brown's own sons. John Brown was wounded and captured. John Brown was taken to nearby Charlestown to be tried for treason against the state of Virginia and inciting a slave revolt. It was a speedy trial, and massive military support was sent to prevent any attempt to free Brown or any other insurrection. On November 2nd, John Brown was found guilty and sentenced to hang, but during this time, his eloquence became known. His words stand as powerful statements against slavery. John Brown became a symbol for those who wanted to end slavery. The intellectual abolitionists, such as Emerson and Thoreau, took up his cause and used their influence to create a mythic figure for abolition. Both sides made an effort at this point to control public opinion.
John Brown was found guilty for his acts at Harper's Ferry, and on the 2nd of December 1859, he was hanged. He died for his cause and was later referred to as an abolitionist martyr. Brown's acts have inspired many people to fight for what is right and fight for freedom. The acts led by John Brown and his men caused Southerners to worry greatly about their lifestyle and how it would be changed, like having no more slaves. Instead of losing their slaves, the Southerners convicted and they hung Brown. This hanging reinforced the conflict versus the North and South, and as a result the raid at Harper's Ferry became one of the main contributing factors that led to the American Civil War.
Have you any last words, John Brown?
I am only walking as God foreordained I should walk. But I cannot remember a night so dark as to have hindered the coming day, or a storm so furious as to prevent the return of warm sunshine and the country at peace. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land can never be purged away but with blood.
Oh, John Brown's body lies molding in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured out to save. And though he lost his life in his struggle to free the slaves, his truth is marching on. John Brown's body lies molding in the grave. John Brown's body lies molding in the grave. John Brown's body lies molding in the grave, but his truth still marches on.